Okay, don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe. Very important, trying to get my subscribers up. I've had one of my episodes in my library of my podcast reach over 15,000. That's really great. And I want to keep that going. So tonight I'm going to talk about a life experience, something that happened to me that doesn't happen to most people when they turn 18 nowadays, or most males. It changed the trajectory, so to speak, of my life. And just a really short story, introspective, and something, as I said, that doesn't happen to young people nowadays. So, Cal, this was
Hey,
something that was interesting in my life.
so JR, I remember you had this experience as a senior in high school, and this thing could have ended your life or changed your life trajectory. Fill me more about that story and that experience.
Yeah, so basically, it's that if I had to put this as a chapter in my book, it would be how smoking weed saved my life and me going to Vietnam. And today,
Oh,
we look at weed or marijuana or whatever you want to call it as an everyday thing. It's legal in many states. But when I was growing up in my teenage years, late teens, I mean, marijuana was still a drug that not only would you get arrested for, but you could be sentenced to jail. You could be put in jail for a couple of months, even for a small amount of marijuana. It was really considered something of a hard illegal substance, and it wasn't looked lightly upon until you got to the very late 70s. But we're talking early 70s. I'm in high school. So really, if I had to call this a chapter, it would be how smoking weed could have saved my life or kept me from Vietnam. And this is the short story that I'm going to tell. So at this time period, I'm actually a senior in high school,
hmm.
and the Vietnam War is ranging on, but to a degree, is kind of coming to an end. The country, as you remember, was going through a period of an anti-war movement. You know, just if you think of Black Lives Matter and what was happening in the country a little over 2 years ago, there were protests in the streets, there were marches, anti-war demonstrations on all the college campuses, because the public and especially young people had turned against the war in Vietnam that had been going on
Yes,
for a
yes.
couple of
I
years.
remember the anti-war movement and how controversial the war was becoming.
Oh, yes, it was very controversial. And at Vietnam, for Black Americans, it was a really dismal situation. It was a meat grinder. They were sending, this came out many years later, Robert McNamara, who was head of Defense Department, was deliberately targeting inner city Black youth to draft them, send them to Vietnam, to the killing fields. And though Black men or Black youth were only 11% of the US population, in some months of the Vietnam War, 60 and 70% of the casualties being killed or wounded were actually African Americans, Black men. At this time in the country, you didn't have a large Hispanic population. It was mostly Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, specifically New York. And you didn't have African immigrants. You didn't have a large onset of new people coming to from the Caribbean to America, though there had been a fairly large group of people from the Caribbean in earlier generations. So it was really what I would say 80 or West, American descendants of slaves, Black Americans coming out of the inner cities and the South that were being drafted. And what happened is that when you turned 18 at that time period, you had to register for the draft. So the war is going on and people don't want to go, but there was a draft which was mandatory. You turn 18, you have to go to the Selective Service Department, which was a part of the Defense
Hmm.
Department.
Hmm.
You got a draft card, which you felt good about because now you could show that you're of age to maybe go into a bar, or I'm 18 years old now. It's a big thing. But it was also a scary time to get that draft card. And what they were doing was they would pull these numbers. You would have a draft number. And every month they would pull these numbers out and they would publish them in the paper. And if that draft number, if yours was in that 10 of 10, it was a good likelihood that you would get a draft notice to report to the U.S. Army. On a non-voluntary basis, you'd be forced to do this. And at this point in the country, men, young people, those who had money, it was mostly whites, were fleeing to Canada They would go over the border up to the border of Canada if they were drafted, or if they didn't want to have their draft card. There were people actually burning their draft cards. They're saying, I'm not going. And then, of course, on the black experience, we had people like Muhammad Ali, who what he did was deliberately turned down an opportunity when he was drafted, and the selective service said, well, you could do something similar to Elvis Presley or another famous boxer, Joe Louis, and just promote the military. They weren't going to send him to Vietnam to get killed. But he, of course, said, no Vietnamese ever called me a nigger. And no, I'm not going. And his case went to the Supreme Court. And he eventually won. But as you know, he lost millions of dollars and lost his championship belt. So this is the backdrop of what was going on. So I registered for the draft. I'm only a senior in high school. So I'm not worried about going to Vietnam. Now, I want to say that I was not per se an anti-war person. I grew up with black men who served in World War II. My friends' fathers fought with Ike in the European campaign. I had men that I knew that were part of Patton's tank battalions. My Boy Scout troop leader and the founder of my Boy Scout troop, Troop 363 in Harlem, was a Tuskegee Airman. My brother was a Marine. My sister's boyfriend was a paratrooper. So I wasn't, like against the military, anti-war, anything like that. And as a young person, I actually went to a military summer camp, but though it wasn't in my sights for what I wanted to do with my life, I wanted to go to college. I was filling out college applications, and I knew that I wanted to pursue doing something in business. I had my life planned out. I also had a girlfriend I was very serious with. So,
But Jerry, how did you wind up at the military camp?
Well, that's going.
What kind of camps going on in New York, man? Why there?
Yeah, well, I'll tell those stories at another time, because I had a lot of experience with summer camps, Catholic camps. I went to a Jewish camp one summer, but one of my first camps was St. Patrick's Villa, which at the time was a Catholic military camp in New York. And my mother's best friend had two older sons who went to that military school. And I used to like when they came by my house, they'd have their uniforms on because they went to a military school when they came back on break. So my mother said, okay, to see if you like this, they have a summer camp. I'm going to send you there. The only downside of that, I don't want to get off track here, is that when I went, one of them went with me to the summer camp, but he only stayed for 2 weeks. I had to stay there another 2 weeks as the only black kid, with a bunch of Irish and Italian kids. I was only 8 years old. In the 1960s, race, as you know, was a very difficult thing to deal with. And it was kind of one of my first experiences with racism as a young person. So it was
that's a setup for another
right. That's a whole nother thing. So getting back to this, I'm drafted. I'm not drafted. Excuse me. I got my draft card, and I'm registered for the draft. And the military, because the war was going bad and we were losing a lot of soldiers, they were speeding up trying to draft more soldiers to go into the war, because nobody was volunteering, very few people, to go into the military. And what happened, as they needed more soldiers, they used to have something called a deferment. And a deferment was, if you went to college, even though you had your draft card, they wouldn't draft you. Why? Because we needed doctors and lawyers and teachers and business people. Oh, you're going to college? Okay, don't worry, even though your draft number came up. Oh, your draft number came up. Oh, you're a father, you just got married, you have 2 kids, one is a baby. Okay, don't worry, no problem. Just forget about it. Well, it got to the point in the war that they weren't doing that anymore. There was no more deferments. Medical. Now, of course, you hear about people like Donald Trump. Of course, his father had money. They paid a doctor off to some bogus medical letters, and with bone spurs, he got out of it. I forgot what happened with Bill Clinton, but there were ways that these people were still getting out of service, but unfortunately not black inner city youth. So one day in the mail, I get this notice from the draft board, and I opened it up, and earlier, actually a week earlier, my number was in the newspaper, as like the second number. But I'm still not thinking about this. I'm a young person. I'm in high school. I'm like, oh, they're not going to call me. And the letter was an induction letter. And it with the letter was 2 tokens to get on the subway to go down to be inducted into the United States Army. And I'm like, no, this can't be. I'm going to college. I have a girlfriend. You know, I'm serious with my girlfriend. I have all my plans for my life. I'm not going into no army, and I'm not going to Vietnam. You got to be crazy. So first thing I do is I go to my high school principal, Father William Mahoney, a nice Irishman, and I say, Father, not Father, excuse me, Monsignor, I got this letter from the draft board. I'm graduating in a few months. This is my senior year. They want me to report for an induction, like blah, blah, blah. Oh, don't worry about it, Mr. Roebuck. We'll take care of it. So he writes a letter to the draft board, and they write him back and say, doesn't matter. He can finish high school in the Army. Now, meanwhile, I only had a few more months. I'm going to graduate. Like, what are you talking about? You're going to take me out of high school? Yes, we're going to take you out of high school. So I really didn't know what else to do at that point. And I remember the night before, I'm at my house. My mother's really upset. She's like, you know, she didn't want to show emotion, but she's nervous and upset. My girlfriend, early in the day, we were together, and she's upset because both of her brother-in-law, she had 2 older twin sisters, and both of her brother-in-laws, her older sister's husbands were in Vietnam. And I used to talk to them when they came back. One of them made a career out of the military. He was in the Marines. He became a drill sergeant, died later in service too. They would tell me their horror stories about ambushes at night, being in the jungle, rats as big as cats, how many times they almost got killed. I mean, really terrifying. I mean, I was interested in their stories, but it wasn't good stories. The other thing that happened personally to me, my brother's wife's brother, who was basically my in-law, he turned 18, and when he became 19, he volunteers for the U.S. Army. And we were having Thanksgiving dinner. This is a few years prior to me getting this notice. And we were notified that he was shot in Vietnam. We didn't know what was wrong. We get this information. And what happened was he was out on patrol. His platoon came under fire. They actually were overrun by the Viet Cong. They killed everybody except him. He was shot in the head. He kind of played dead. And to survive, which he did for a number of hours, I don't know how he did this, when he was eventually rescued, they had to fly him to Hawaii for an emergency operation, but he lost his vision. So he came back, a young man, 19, blind, angry, became an alcoholic, and was dead within a very short period of time, within a couple of years. So I actually witnessed this taking place over my high school years, and it really affected me as much as also being in high school and hearing over the loudspeaker occasionally when a former student who maybe graduated 2 or 3 years before had been drafted, went into the Army or some branch of the service, and was killed in Vietnam. And in the morning before school would start, they would make an announcement. We want to have some prayers, silent prayers this morning for a former student. You know, they would give the student's name, and we would say a prayer for him who had passed. So that was the backdrop of what was going on. So as I said, I get this notice, and now I have to go down to the draft board. So I go down, not to the draft board, but for this induction. And when I get down there, it's a very kind of crazy, like hectic situation. The room is full of Black and Hispanic young men. There's a few white young men there, but it was, I would say, 70% or more Black and Hispanic. And all of the officers and young officers there were all white. And they were, being, a little bossy. They were explaining to us what was going to happen. So the first thing we did was we took an aptitude test, which was like a 7th grade reading and English and math test. So for me, that was pretty easy. Was basic, like I said, a very basic test. So the next thing is the physical. So you go through a physical, and it's really rudimentary. Like when you go to your doctor for a physical, they check your heartbeat, your pulse, they look in your ear, they did an X-ray, all of that. So now basically this is like the last point, and I'm like, oh man, and I'm just accepting what is or what's coming, and the next piece is a psychological test. So I'm sitting on this bench waiting to go in to talk to this psychiatrist. And there's a young Puerto Rican guy sitting there next to me. So we just strike up a conversation and we start talking about Vietnam. And I told him about my sister-in-law's brother, what had happened to him. And he said, yeah, man, I lost both an older uncle and an older cousin over the past year in Vietnam. So I'm like, wow, so we're talking about this. This is a real short conversation. And he says, but I don't know if you know this, but there's, with the exemptions and this, they're not taking, people with drugs, that you have drug problems and stuff. So I said, no, there's no more exemptions. I said, I'm in high school. I'm going to graduate. I'm supposed to finish high school in a few months. And they're taking me out of high school, telling me to finish in the Army. He says, yeah, they need people. And there is no more exemptions, but because so many soldiers have drug habits and they are trying to curtail the amount of soldiers in Vietnam using drugs, people who are using drugs, they're not inducting them. And my cousin on my mother's side of the family was inducted a few weeks ago, and he shoots up and he had tracks on his arms, and they saw that and they just sent him home. So I'm like, are you sure about this? He's like, I'm telling you, and then he shows me, that he was from the Bronx, as a matter of fact, and he shows me he's got tracks on his arm. He said, I use drugs. He says, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm telling the truth and blah, 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 blah. So I'm like, this is something that I was not aware of. I just heard that or knew that there were no exemptions for anything at all. And my last ditch effort, as I mentioned, my Monsignor from my Catholic high school wrote a letter to the draft board, and they just sent them back a short, curt note, like a thanks but no thanks. So within a few seconds, they call him into this room. So he gets up, he goes into the room. A couple of minutes go by, door opens, he comes out, he looks at me, he smiles, he gives me a thumbs up, and he walks down the hallway. And I'm like, I don't know what that's about. So the next thing, they call my name. The guy's got a clipboard with my paperwork. I walk in this room, there's this guy sitting behind the desk, he looks at my clipboard, so he starts going through. So then he starts asking me a couple of basic questions. Do I have any anger management problems? Do I have a short temper? How many times have I ever been in a physical altercation? Do I have a problem with taking instructions from an authority figure? So I'm answering all the questions truthfully. And then I'm like, well, when is he going to ask me any questions about drugs? This guy who's telling me this is like full of it, right? And then he says, all of a sudden, do you have a drinking problem, or whatever? I said, no, I don't have a drinking problem. Then he says, well, they didn't used to say substance abuse. He said, do you use drugs casually, or have you ever experimented with drugs? So I said, I was honest. I said I smoked marijuana. I don't remember if I said weed or whatever at the time was the slogan saying, excuse me, that we used to say. I probably said weed. And all of a sudden he just like leaned back in the chair, and then he started writing real fast. And he says, okay, well, how many times have you smoked weed? And I'm trying to remember. I really couldn't remember. It was only a few times. It wasn't like young people today, who kind of smoke weed. They get up in the morning, they can't go out of their door. Anytime they get together with their friends, they have to smoke weed. As you remember, when we were growing up in our late high school years and college years, you smoked weed occasionally if there was a party, like you were going to hang out with friends. It was something special. It was an occasion. you didn't even want to be looked at as someone that was always smoking weed, because then you were called a pothead, like a drug addict. So it was just something that you either experimented with, as you know, or you just did it once or twice because you wanted to fit in with everybody else. So,
Right.
yeah, so I explained that. And then he says, okay, well, what about any other drugs? Any heroin, any this? And he's asking me. So nobody did cocaine then. I mean, cocaine was unheard of. I don't even think very many rich people, though they knew what it was, had experimented. And it didn't come to the late 70s that cocaine became a popular drug in nightclubs and discos. So I said, no, I have some friends that unfortunately got hooked on heroin. And, you know, those individuals were some people that I grew up with. And I was around them. So he says, wait a minute, you have friends that use heroin? So he's writing down. So there was a girl that I dated in high school prior to my girlfriend I was with at the time, I was very serious with. And she started sniffing heroin. And from sniffing, she went to skin popping. Many years later, she eventually became a heroin addict herself. So I explained that I had a girlfriend that had sniffed heroin, and that she went on to skin popping heroin, and that she was my ex-girlfriend. So he starts writing this down. So then the next thing he says, well, have you ever been tempted to use heroin or use any drugs, hard drugs? And I said, no, but on one occasion, you know, I was with her and she offered me to try it, which I wouldn't, but I tasted it, which was the worst taste I ever experienced. I mean, I remember feeling nauseous and wanting to spit the quinine out. It just made me feel like I had to throw up. And he just like went bananas at that point. So he just started writing down more. And then he says, okay, you're going to get a new classification, and you're to go down this hallway. There's going to be some other paperwork that you're going to be given, boom, boom, boom. And I said, well, what happens now? He says, well, you're going to get a new classification, and you're not going to be inducted today. That's it. So I was like, wow. So I got up, I go down the hallway, and I go in this room where this guy's a sergeant, and he looks at the papers, he starts writing, he asks me one or two more questions, and he says, he gives me some of the papers, he says, you can go home. And, you know, that experience changed my life, because I didn't know, you know, like even like the $1 million question when I walked out of there was a police officer going to come and arrest me, because it was that era that, you know, admitting that you smoke weed, you know,
they have to prove it. They heard you say it.
Right. They heard me say it. For all I knew, it could have been on tape, and I could have been arrested for smoking weed.
He saved your life. But hey, JR, here's the real deal. Did you think that Puerto Rican guy told you what he told you was the truth?
At the time, I didn't know whether he was just talking, you know, making something up, something that he was going to try to get out of being inducted. I had no idea. Or what crossed my mind was somebody told him some BS, you know? So only thing I said to myself was, I don't know if this guy is telling the truth or not, but I know it's almost like you're under oath. Whatever they're going to ask me, I'm just going to tell them the truth. Just like if they ask me, am I in high school? I'm not going to go and say, no, I graduated already. No, I'm graduating in a few months. So why am I really here? You know, but the eerie feeling was at the end of all that, you know, being there and getting ready to leave and turning back and looking at a lot of those black and brown faces. And then I said there were some young white men there, young guys there too, excuse me, because I wouldn't say anybody was a man. We were all 18, 19 years old. So we were young men, young, very young men. And wondering who was going to make it back, who was going to land in a year or so after basic training at JFK Airport, and they'd be good, and who might come back in the body bag. Because at that time period in Vietnam, you had to serve a year in combat. So once you finished basic training and you were shipped off, you had to survive 1 year. And after a year, unless you were wounded or something happened, then even though you may have had to serve 2 or 3 years, you were good after that. If you saw the movie Platoon, and there's been other movies made about guys, they used to count the days that they were actually in service, or what they called in country. And they be count, I got to make it 10 more days. I hope I don't have to go out on a mission. I hope. And, you know, I think in the movie Platoon, or if not, it was another movie where a guy, it's his last day, and he actually gets killed on his last day. And I remember, I have a lot of neighbors that are vets, but one neighbor who's not a vet met someone on a cruise, and they were talking. So the second day that he and this guy are on the cruise, and they're talking more of their life stories, the guy tells him he's a Vietnam vet, and he says the second day that he's in Vietnam, he gets sent out on patrol, and that night they get into a vicious firefight. And when he wakes up, only him and one other person were alive. Everybody that he had just met in his platoon, everybody was killed. He's only there his second day that night. So he wakes up that morning. Well, he'd been stayed awake all night trying to stay alive. But when the sun came out and the Viet Cong had left, that morning when the sun came up, it was just him and one other person left alive, you know. So I say that because I had visions of the end of my life, and I believe that you talk about a trajectory that had I went and had to go to Vietnam, that I wouldn't have come back. If I did, I would have been in a body bag, which is not funny. It's like a premonition, like, right. you know if something happens to you. If not, my life would have been altered as well. One way or the other. One way or the other, because even if I did go, coming back, I would have went to college, but where would I have went? Would I have met the friends that I had? Would I have met my wife? Would I have went into promotion? With all the things that I did in my life probably would not have happened. So it shows you how your path of life to a degree is already set, and that how just one thing, fate, the fate that I turned 18, and when I did, unfortunately my number came up for the draft. And then how I did get drafted, and though in years prior to this I would have been exempted because I was finishing high school. So they would have said, okay, well, finish high school, well, we're going to pick new numbers, and hopefully my number would have never came up again, so I wouldn't have been drafted. But because it was at that point of the war that they were just sending, they needed bodies, that they didn't care what. If you were married and had 10 kids, if you were a doctor about to get his degree to become a heart surgeon, if you were in high school like me and about to graduate in a couple of weeks, it doesn't matter. Let's go. You can finish high school in the Army. But I've been at this high school for 3.5 years. I got a few more months. I'm graduating. Hey, sorry. Let's go. Uncle Sam.
In fact, the smarter, the more we want you.
Well, there's been a lot written about that. Whether they needed anybody, so it didn't matter smart or dumb. But there were instances, there's been a lot of books written about McNamara and how they deliberately targeted, as I said, our community, the black community, really draining a lot of the future of black America, young black men, to be destined to go be killed or wounded or come back as drug addicts or whatever happened to them, never being the same, to Vietnam. But they were also taking, this is known, if you got in trouble with the police for something minor, let's say you stole a hubcap off of a car, and we know that the criminal justice system back then was different than it was today. You get in front of the wrong judge, where they would say, okay, you don't want to go to jail for 3 months because you didn't just take the hubcap. We know you really wanted to steal the car. You could join the Army. and you'll have a clean record. You'll get your life together. You'll get some discipline, and we can forget about this. And they were doing this all over the country, and unfortunately, that happened to a lot of people. And to this day, the United States government, there's something called Agent Orange that was dropped on the foliage in Vietnam to clear the jungles of the topography of the trees and so forth, so that the Air Force would have an easier way of bombing the Viet Cong and doing a lot of other things as well. And this chemical agent that they use, Agent Orange, because they called it Agent Orange because it was this orange cloud that would kill, the leaves and everything. They had to know that it was going to harm human beings.
Dioxin, a contaminant in Agent Orange. To birth defects in laboratory animals, the spraying of this herbicide was discontinued in 1970. The herbicide was also eventually banned in the U.S. That did not stop the growing concern about Agent Orange, which took a new turn a few years after the last American soldier had left Vietnam in 1975.
Milton Ross, a Special Forces advisor near Pleiku, has a son born without the tips of his fingers.
Frank Moore is nearly dead from cancer. He thinks the cancer was caused by chemical defoliants he was exposed to as a soldier in Vietnam.
And people came back with all types of physical ailments that still to this day, you hear that the veterans of fighting, most of these guys have died, unfortunately, to get a real fair compensation for the damage that was done to their health by those chemicals with Agent Orange, and then so many other things.
Most of it was mental. A lot of brothers went out mentally.
Oh yeah, I mean there were a lot. I had a good friend whose brother recently died. I talked to him at a funeral up in New York, and he said the last time he was in New York was his brother's funeral, and his brother, which is his older brother, and he said when his brother came back from Vietnam, he was never the same. He was just not the same person, and he ended up going from being on drugs to being homeless to just really being a person that his mother and father and he no longer recognized. And though that happened in other wars, the difference about Vietnam, I want to wrap up here, was that in most cases, World War II, United States military didn't get involved till late in the war. And when we did with the D-Day invasion, and we marched across Europe, meeting Stalin's army, the Russians halfway into Germany, into Berlin, the fighting only lasted a few months. And in some cases, there were engagements, so it wasn't every day. You had the Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of the Ardennes, and guys were there for weeks on end. But in Vietnam, you're there a year. You may have been in firefights 3-4 days a week. So if you're going out on patrol 4, 5, 6 days out of a week, you might come into a combat situation every day. So imagine that day after day after day. Even when we had the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, after we successfully took over Iraq, there was an insurgency, but you weren't being sent out to fight the insurgency every day. You were at base camp, and occasionally if you went into certain areas, you went on patrol, you might have come under fire. They had IEDs going off. But in Vietnam, there were just all types of booby traps. If you were out on patrol, at some point, you were going to come under fire. It was just a situation where people were putting it into a stressful situation on a daily basis. And these people, the Vietnamese, were fighting for their country. We went to their country to try to almost, you want to say, enforce a different way of life on them, which was all BS. They had fought for over 1,000 years to be free. They fought the Chinese in numerous wars. Then it became French Indonesia. They tried to kick the French out. And then at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they eventually kicked the French out. And then we got involved with the Kennedy administration only through support as advisors, not to actually be there and fight. But then there was something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident that got us involved, and then we just kept sending more and more soldiers and dropping more and more bombs. We dropped more bombs in Vietnam in one day than we dropped on all of Germany in World War II. I mean, we bombed them back to the Stone Age, and we just threw everything at them. And at the end, we had to come home. We didn't win, and over 66,000 plus Americans lost their lives. So it was really a sad scenario. And for those, not people who volunteered to go, or you were in the U.S. Military Academy, or if you were went to West Point, but for those people who really didn't have any opportunities in life, that were forced to go, and their families didn't have money, they couldn't send them to Canada, they couldn't get doctors a note. There was nothing that really gave them an opportunity to want to pursue something different. And as you said, they came back and their lives were never the same. We just have to be humble for them, for their service. So that's my story about turning 18 and something that was really, I would say, traumatic, that could have sent my life on a different trajectory. And how, because as a teenager, I smoked weed in high school a few times, answering a truthful question may have saved my life. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for listening. For those that gave their lives, for those that gave the ultimate sacrifice, thank you for your service.